Thank you, Christine. They're different photos to the ones I was showing this morning. Next we'll ask Paul Jones, who is a senior lecturer from University of Sydney. I've met Paul a number of times through his work that he's been working through the Pacific Islands. He is currently the senior lecturer and program director in the Urban and Regional Planning program at the Faculty of Architecture and Design and Planning at the University of Sydney. Prior to commencing at the University of Sydney at the beginning of 2011, Paul had spent the last 18 years working full-time in urban management and urban development in the Pacific region. This has included working in most Pacific Island states, including long-term work in urban projects and programs in Samoa, Kiribati and PNG. Paul has worked with governments, communities and a range of development partners in the Pacific region, including the Asia Development Bank, AusAid, NZAid, the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, UN ESCAP and UN Habitat, and has a wealth of practical knowledge and insights into issues and challenges confronting the management of Pacific towns and cities. Paul.
Okay. Well, thank you, Sonia, and also thanks to Sonia and Michelle for having me here today, and also on behalf of my colleagues here from the Pacific. It's good that Pia keeps putting the smaller island states on the agenda. So what I wanted to do and try and get through this in 15 minutes is really to have a look at the urbanisation context and the challenges of Pacific towns and cities, so it's pretty well everything on the Pacific Rim, and importantly to see how towns and cities are responding, and importantly to see where the future is going. So pretty well the talk today, it follows on a little bit from some of the context that Christine just showed, and it's most probably the reverse of the context that Austin talked about, but I really want to focus on the small island countries that are everything to the north of New Zealand and to the east of Australia's seaboard. And they comprise about 7,500 islands that cover the largest expanse of water in the world, and they comprise over 20 island nation states. I'm going to spend a minute because to appreciate the diversity and complexity of the Pacific, you really need to understand the differences that exist between these three areas called Melanesia, Micronesia and Polynesia. And if you have a look at those figures on the right-hand side, those population figures start to give you some insight into the differences between what I would call the big islands that comprise Melanesia. So as we'll go into the population in a minute, around about 11 million, you'll see that the bulk of that population resides in Melanesia, followed by Polynesia and Micronesia. And the urban population out of the 11 is somewhere in between, say, about 2.5 to 3 million, and it's most probably a little more than that. So what I think is most important when you look at that spatial representation is to see that Melanesia is really the big islands. They're the bulk of the population. Melan means black, so stands for the Black Islands. Micronesia means small, so they're all the small islands up into Micronesia, Marshall Islands and Kiribati and the like. And then you've got Polynesia to your right with Tonga, Samoa, Cook Islands, Niue, and so forth. Understanding that, if you can grasp those differences in terms of Melanesia versus the rest, or Micronesia and Polynesia versus the rest, that helps you conceptualise some of the issues that are facing the Pacific. So just to go over, there's about 11.1 million people in 2011 based on the latest SPC figures from UMEA, and about the bulk of those are in Melanesia. So Melanesia pretty well being that row of countries that goes up from Fiji to Vanuatu to Solomon Islands to Papua New Guinea. So the average share, the percentage share that are urban, unknown to most who live in Australia, is around about 50%, and arguably it's higher given the way it's under-remunerated. So the actual percentage share is 50%. The actual number living in towns is most probably around the order of about 1 in 4, or 25, most probably 25 to 35%, so just over 1 in 4. The bulk of urban residents live in Melanesia, so they're all those big capital towns like Suva, Honiara, Port Vila and Port Moresby. Melanesia has the lowest urban share, so it's 13% in PNG, 20% in Solomons, but because of their higher underlying population base, they have the highest overall populations and urban populations. But the actual higher urban percentages are to be found in Polynesia and Micronesia. So this slide is a little bit murky, a little bit messy, but what it's really showing is the grey shows you the urban share, and the blue shows you the rural share. And what's the trend that you get out of this is that you find that those states that are in Polynesia and Micronesia will have the greater urban share, but those that are in Melanesia will have the greater rural share, but the reverse is that those in Melanesia have the bigger urban numbers because they have the bigger base populations. So, really understanding Pacific urban, which we're just going to drop into now, it's all about diversity and complexity. And as I said, it's really, in some ways, it's like Melanesia versus the rest. It's like the big islands versus the smaller islands. And Melanesia is complex. It's got lots of ethnic, socio-cultural and linguistic diversity. As Max will talk after this, PNG's got 800 different groups, tribal groups, ethnic groups. It's got the highest urban numbers due to the larger overall population, highest levels of poverty, which we'll drop into. They're also known as weak states or failed states in the main, but on the other hand of that, they're very resource rich and very much similar to some of the African states, very much got the resources right through in all sorts of forms. On the reverse of that, we have Polynesia and Micronesia, so we tend to find more stability there, and one of the reasons is there's more homogeneity in terms of ethnic groups. Some are better managed, and some are resource poor, some of the atolls. So we just have a look at a couple of shots, and we do have some colleagues here today from Kiribati. So we look at some of the diversity in the urban settings. This is actually South Tower in Kiribati, which has about 50,000 people on 17 to 16 square kilometres. Most of us don't appreciate the depth and the range of urban problems that sit on Australia's door. This island is 30 kilometres long and 150 metres wide, and it has 50,000 people on it, and it sits about 1.5 metres above sea level. It's another shot from South Tara. Then we have a look at the big islands, and the range of diversity, the big populations and the big cities. So here's just a few shots of Port Moresby, squatter settlements there on the left, and we see Suva downtown, and there's also squatter settlements there in Suva. Suva's one of the, or Fiji is one of the few of the Melanesian countries to actually have a high percentage in urban. Fiji is about 51%. And Port Moresby, it's the largest Pacific city. It's most probably got in the order of about 600 to 7,000 people. Overall in Port Moresby, out of nearly 7 million people, about 1 to 1.25 million are in urban. And I'll raise that little heading there. Is it a city out of control? In 2004, it was rated as the world's worst livable city. In 2008, it was the third worst livable city, and it still holds that. In 2011, this year, on the Economist rating, it's still rated as the world's third worst city. So Port Moresby is unique, and PNG is unique. 7 million people out of the 11 million, largest urban populations, largest number of cities and towns. 3 cities, Port Moresby, Hagen, and largest number of towns. Port Moresby is mega, and the thing that we want to focus on in a minute too is the fact that you need to get your head around that out of that 600,000 to 700,000 in Port Moresby, 45% to 50% of those people live in squatter or informal settlements. So we just to sort of, before I just want to drop down into two of these, before we sort of push towards the end. Currently there's some work being done by the ADB on the State of Pacific Towns and Cities report. And some of the cross-island challenges that come out are listed here. Things to do with growing and changing population, especially the youth bulge. A large number of youth, very fertile, which will lead to higher population growth. Issues to do with land, customary land, mobilising customary land, affordable housing, service and infrastructure, the role of the formal and informal urban economy, the extent of rising urban poverty, which is becoming endemic, issues to do with blending state and traditional governance systems. It was good to see the Minister talk about planning systems, because there has been a lot of work done by some of the countries in Polynesia and more recently PNG on better planning systems, climate change, and the other one to point is getting stakeholders on the same urban agenda, getting a coalition of support, which has been problematic in the Pacific. I just want to focus just on two of those issues there. Just briefly, just want to highlight, talk about land and housing and urban poverty. And I think the main point here, this is some basic needs poverty work that was done by UNDP last year. And I think one of the interesting things that came out of the global financial crisis was actually to elevate urban onto the actual development agenda in terms of discussion. Because prior to that, as we well know, a lot of the development agenda is still very much rural-based and still rooted and anchored in rural programs, that the rural programs solve everything. But what this diagram here clearly shows you, out of the 12 countries that are shown, if you look at the white as urban, 8 out of the 12 have greater urban poverty levels than rural. And that's significant when we look to see some of the consequences of what this environment of poverty does. And the second one is just I want to really make the point, and obviously poverty and land and housing, you can't really unjoin the two, is really that what we're seeing as a result of the demise in some of these states is the escalation of squatter and informal settlements. Port Moresby, 45 to 50% squatters, Honiara, 30%, Suva, some people say it's 50, some 30 to 40%. And so the key point really to take is that all Pacific towns have varying levels of major squatters and settlement expansion. And this is leading to something which I've been couching in some of these terms to try and get the message across. We used it early this year with Sonia at the PIA conference, is that it's leading to the rise of what we call the rural village in the city, or village cities. And really this will be the main urban form for Pacific towns and cities for the next 15, 20 years and onwards. So in other words, what we're going to see is lots of settlements and squatter settlements. If we had more time, a lot of these, in fact, to replicate their rural origins, their strong connectivity, they're in enclaves, they'll represent a certain part of the country and they'll stay in those groups within the city. And then when there's enough of those, then what you're getting in terms of an urban form and structure is something that's very much a village city. And not that this is very clear, but I got one of my students from PNG, and those sort of coloured blobs are sort of representing some of the mix of settlements and squatter settlements that are in Port Moresby. I'll just briefly just show you, these are just some slides of a settlement called 4 Mile Settlement, which is a squatter settlement in Port Moresby. It's just to illustrate this growing escalation of settlements and the fact that this village city is really the way that things are going, and how do we deal with it and how do we plan with it when it's very hard to get a coalition of support to even look at these sorts of things. And likewise, but not to the same degree, as some of our colleagues will know this here from Curus, this is the same thing. this is the sort of form that you see, so villages, and in fact, you know, very much urban in Kiribati is pretty well rural villages, and this is squatter housing in South Tara. So again, it's this village city. So how are cities responding to these sorts of issues? What are some of the trends? Just going to wrap up, there's only 3 or 4 to go. And the bottom line is that the Pacific countries that most need the assistance do not have the capacity. They're overwhelmed by the speed and nature of urbanisation, and day-to-day survival and poverty overwhelms the response. That's the context in which a lot of this happens. You're working in these offices, again, depending which country you work in. In the office that I was working in, that Max is here from PNG, maybe a half of those staff would live in settlements, and a lot of those have actually got university degrees. So I think that the conception about the sorts of people that live in these places is really changing. So countries are struggling against a background of weak to poor economic performance and ineffective governance and failed states. And how are they responding? Well, it's a bit of hit and miss, it's a bit of splutter here and there, but things are happening. There are some keen people, there are some champions. Urban development projects are happening in water, and sanitation, roads, health, education, but they must be financed, and you need donors, you need partnerships to work together. Urban management systems are being changed and fine-tuned, or new institutions, and there's been some good work done by our colleagues here today who are in Samoa and Tonga, and also, as Max will talk about, there's been some good work, and that's being implemented in PNG. There's also pilot projects. It was mentioned before about the need for pilot projects. There's good work happening in climate change, but most importantly, there's things happening in terms of mobilising customary land, which is often the root. A lot of the main issues that in these towns is now trying to get large clans and groups together and mobilise their land. And often, the more and more you deal with this, is that governments and communities as well are looking for entry points. They're looking for entry points into the urban sector. How do we get into it? You know, things are sensitive, land's sensitive, so how do we come into it? How do we know there's issues, we know there's service and infrastructure issues, but how do we enter it? And that the unintended consequences are minimised. And I'm sure Max will talk about this. This is the most recent innovative policy work done in the Pacific in PNG. So just to sum up, last slide. Pacific cities, I hope I'm not sounding too negative, struggling with urbanisation. There's a need for a coalition of change and all on the same page. And we should be fairly honest here that one of the issues that we have, or that a lot of the Pacific countries have, is that the Australian government, unfortunately, their overseas development arm, does not have urban as a mainstream sector. And that's one of the issues in the Pacific when trying to mobilise stakeholders. It's very hard when your largest donor, when your largest player, doesn't have a consistent interest in urban issues. Cities concentrate poverty, but they also represent the best hope of escaping it. And I suppose the question you ask is just how relevant is that for Pacific towns and cities in the light of escalation of squatters and settlements and rising poverty? Because what we're finding more and more when you go and talk to these people in settlements, and talk to colleagues here in the room, people will tell you that they're moving to towns and cities because they see urban poverty as a better scenario than living in rural poverty. And that's not good. Partnerships must be forged, and partnerships must be long-term. We need to get out of this project cycle, or balance the project cycle, which is often the way a lot of these roads and water and so forth are all done in project cycles. Countries need to be demanding a longer-term vision and being stuck in there for the next 10, 15, 20 years. The other really problematic issue is to balance policy with action. So it's about better governance, but at the same time, people are crying, people are hurting, and services and infrastructure need to be on the ground now. There's no point having a donor talking about capacity building and 450 advisors there about good governance. It's this balance. There's people, you know, service and infrastructure need to be there and other issues. And finally, the last point to make is that a lot of the issues here are really, it's a matter of how we conceptualise and look at them. And the big challenge for a lot of us, and also especially for our donors, is really to look at look through a different set of lens when you look at these issues.